Welcome to Energy Insights, the podcast where we unpack the decisions, challenges, and opportunities shaping Asia's energy transition. I'm your host, Stephen. Today, we're talking about a problem that's quietly reshaping energy planning across Southeast Asia. It's not politics or price volatility this time. It's something far more technical, but with huge implications, a shortage of gas turbines. Now, if you never thought about gas turbines before, you're not alone. But as the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis points out in its recent report, this shortage is already slowing down major LNG projects in Vietnam and the Philippines. That means higher costs, longer delays, and some tough questions about whether gas can really serve as a reliable bridge fuel many governments were counting on. To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by someone who has been following this issue closely. We have Sam Reynolds, research lead for LNG and Gas at IEEFA Asia. Sam has been analyzing gas markets, standard assets risk, and transition economics across the region for years. Sam, welcome to Energy Insights.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here. So today we're going to be discussing issues and topics basically about the turbine shortage across Asia and a specific region that we're going to focus on. So Sam, let's start with something that we really like to know as a basic. So the shortage is a global shortage of gas turbines, and it's what's really behind of this shortage and how did it become such a big issue for Asia's LNG projects?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. It's a great place to start. I want to first explain for our listeners, without getting too technical, why gas turbines are so incredible, why they're such impressive pieces of engineering, right? They contain tens of thousands of distinct components. They can weigh up to 500 tons. That's roughly twice the weight of the Statue of Liberty. But turbine blades may be just 1 millimeter in thickness. They have to be able to withstand up to temperatures of up to 1700 degrees Celsius for decades at a time. And they've been called the crown jewel of energy manufacturing. Actually, fewer countries can produce heavy duty gas turbines than can enrich uranium. So these are really just incredible pieces of machinery. And there's a very high barrier to entry for companies wanting to make them. And that's why only 3 companies have historically dominated the market. I'm talking about GE Vernova, spun off from General Electric, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and Siemens Energy. And together, these 3 companies have produced about 90% of heavy duty gas turbines since 2015. Now, what's behind the current bottlenecks? Well, there's very high demand for turbines due to things like rising electricity demand growth, a need to replace aging fossil fuel assets, plus a high demand for energy from data centers and power consumption for things like artificial intelligence and cloud computing, et cetera. That demand is coming from regions, primarily the United States, the Middle East, and Europe. Now, when you combine those demand factors with supply challenges, I'm talking about labor shortages, materials and component shortages, you get this very large bottleneck, in the gas turbine industry. And so all 3 of those companies have very large backlogs of orders. They're taking reservations about 4 to 5 years out, so 2029 and 2030. But they're also advising gas developers to plan 7 to 8 years ahead for turbine deliveries, right? So essentially, if I started the process today, my gas plant wouldn't be online until 2032 or 2033. And that doesn't even begin to factor in the higher costs, which I'm sure we'll get into more. So Essentially, when you hear from the fossil fuel industry about natural gas as a fuel of the future or necessary in the global energy transition, often what is lost is an understanding of the limitations on the equipment manufacturing itself.
Thank you, Sam, for the knowledge for our listeners, and then the highlights on the manufacturers of the three top manufacturers. So linked to this LNG developments in places like Philippines and Vietnam. So looking right at this closer Southeast Asia, why are the Philippines and Vietnam they are particularly affected by this turbine shortage? If you want us to get through.
Yeah, well, I'd start by saying that this is a global issue. Countries around the world are being affected. But the Philippines and Vietnam are two very interesting case studies because both countries have envisioned gas as really central to their energy plans going forward. Vietnam has among the most ambitious gas development plans in the region. It wants to build nearly 40 gigawatts of new gas capacity by 2030. And very few of those proposed projects have actually secured turbines, let alone the necessary contracts that would begin construction or achieve financial closure. In the Philippines, there are nearly 11 gigawatts of planned power projects, but none of them have secured gas turbines. So not only is there a real threat to the timing of these plans, but costs have also risen very dramatically in just the last 2 years alone. Before one might assume a cost, to put some numbers here, of $800 per kilowatt for the gas plants. But in the US now, companies are reporting that costs have increased nearly threefold up to $2,400 per kilowatt. So going back to my, proposed project, if I started it today, if I wanted to build a 1 gigawatt plant, I used to be able to assume that would cost $800 million. But now we're talking about a price tag of nearly $2.5 billion, right? So the impacts on energy plans are dramatic. The impact on costs are dramatic. And ultimately, households and taxpayers in both countries are going to have to foot the bill. It's basically like getting in line at the world's longest in the world's longest line at a restaurant, only to then pay very expensive prices for a subpar meal. And that's leaving countries with the question of, well, how do we meet energy demand in a timely and affordable way going forward?
Very interesting. So, it has become the impact is serious, and then when the projects are delays, costs are going up. In terms of this region transitions, I mean global shortage. So the LNG competitiveness, what does that mean for economic and strategic case in the region?
Yeah, it's a great question. The narrative behind natural gas and liquefied natural gas, which is just gas that's been frozen into liquid form and it's transported via ships rather than pipeline. That narrative has largely been driven by the fossil fuel industry itself. They've framed gas and LNG as affordable, secure, and sustainable. But when you look back at the last 5 years, it's really easy to see why none of these claims hold up to scrutiny, right? After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, prices for that liquefied natural gas skyrocketed because Europe was buying so much more via ships rather than via Russian connected pipelines. And they were paying top dollar for those liquefied natural gas supplies. And that meant that emerging markets couldn't compete and couldn't afford the fuel. They weren't able to compete with the wealthier buyers in Europe and Northeast Asia. And so, in many parts of South and Southeast Asia, there were fuel shortages, power outages, economic losses, etc. And I see a very similar situation today, only this time it's not for the fuel, it's for the hardware itself, right? During that 2022 energy crisis, emerging markets couldn't afford the fuel because they had to compete with those wealthier buyers. But this time, those same markets are struggling to get their hands on the gas turbines because of wealthier buyers in the US, the Middle East, and Europe. So I think this is yet another hit to the industry sales pitch for LNG as affordable and secure.
Thank you. Thank you for the concrete answer and the explanations about this strategic case in the region for LNG. So let's move on to the next part where we focus for Philippines and Vietnam to take a closer look what's really happening on the ground. So starting stating with the Philippines, where turbines delays are already reshaping energy plans, investment decisions, and consumer confidence. So let's start with Philippines, where LNG has been promoted as a cornerstone of the country's transition strategy. So how is this turbine shortage affecting that plan? And then what does it mean for country's energy security?
Yeah, absolutely. The Philippines is in an interesting situation because its only source of gas right now is the Malampaya gas reserve. And that reserve is being rapidly depleted, expected to run dry over the next couple years. Now, the country has six existing gas-fired power plants. So the question becomes, well, if we don't have that domestic production, we have to import more LNG, again, via ships traveling long distances to replace those supplies. Now, the Philippines has built two LNG terminals to import that fuel from the water. And so their existing plants have been able to run on those LNG supplies, albeit at more expensive rates. But the build out of new gas plants and the political momentum behind building new gas plants has almost ground completely to a halt, in part because it's so difficult to get hands on these necessary gas turbines. And recently, the um, Philippines Department of Energy Secretary, Sharon Garin, was on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit, and she cited the global shortages of gas turbines as a hindrance to the country's future LNG plans. She then went on to say shortly after, there's enough for now, quote unquote, when speaking about the need for new LNG capacity. She said that the country is unlikely to build more LNG terminals in the near term, and my recent analysis at IEEFA found that none of the proposed LNG projects in the Philippines have made it past very early development stages. Again, none have secured gas turbines. And actually, just last week, we learned about the cancellation of a very large $1.5 billion LNG to power complex in Batangas. This was a massive project backed by some of the most powerful business interests in the country. It had the support of the largest private equity firm in the United States, Blackstone, and it had received several key permits and a certificate of national significance. So its cancellation is a big deal, and I think there were a lot of reasons at play, but the gas turbine shortage is certainly, I've said before, the kind of cherry on top for challenges facing these projects. So this is a very far cry from where the Philippines was, say, 5, 6 years ago, when everybody was promoting LNG as the next big thing to transition from coal. And I think that that shift has been really amazing to see, driven in large part by some of the challenges I've talked about related to gas turbines.
Thank you, Sam. So these changes, the transition, it will help the country very positively moving forward, in your opinion.
I think, there is the challenges and barriers to building new gas-fired power plants in the Philippines leaves the door open for other energy resources to fill the gap. Now, what are those resources? Certainly, the government is thinking about coal. You know, they issued a coal moratorium in 2020, but there have been so many loopholes allowing um, expansion coal facilities and the like. The government is thinking about nuclear, but I think really where the emphasis is now is on renewable energy. And we've seen amazing progress in translating policy into practice in the Philippines. We've seen a lot of government policies that have been there for a long time really starting to be used in a concerted way. And we've seen in recent government auctions for clean energy, for example, that 10 gigawatts of new renewable energy projects, wind, solar, many attached with battery storage, were awarded contracts. So again, all these struggles to build maybe 1 gigawatt or more of gas plants. Meanwhile, you have a massive amount of renewables that I think are going to step in and really take a larger share of the Philippines' energy future going forward. So I would frame that as a win for the climate, but I think more importantly, given the Philippines' position as an emerging market, it's a win for consumers because there is no doubt that wind and solar have demonstrated massive cost reductions. Solar is the fastest growing asset class in the Philippines, and it's also among the cheapest sources of power.
Interesting fact. So we can say that Philippines has a in a greater shape moving forward. Is in a progress. So let's compare with Vietnam. What we are recently seeing in the Philippines. So let's turn to Vietnam. They also have a very ambitious LNG to power program and a power development plan A accordingly. So would you have a bit of a comparison with Philippines?
Yeah, Vietnam, the situation is slightly more complicated, but the overall theme is quite similar. I mentioned before that the country has 40 gigawatts of plans for new gas-fired power capacity. That includes 23 gigawatts run on that imported liquefied natural gas from overseas and 15 gigawatts of capacity that would run on gas that is produced domestically. But by my tally, only one of each, only one plant run on imported LNG and one plant run on domestic gas has secured a gas turbine. So these 2030 targets for 40 gigawatts um, are looking increasingly unrealistic. Now, one interesting point here is that several of these planned projects are still searching for investors. And what they do is the Vietnam allows firms to bid at the lowest cost to secure those projects. Now, in order to bid, companies are required to put down a payment of 1% of the total project cost, right? That ensures that they're sincere about their intention to pursue the project. So for some LNG projects, that 1% bid has been in the realm of about 22 million US dollars. And investors have cited this as a major barrier to investing and bidding for these projects. Now, I'll tie that together with the gas turbine shortage, keeping that $22 million challenge in mind. What we're seeing is that because gas turbine bottlenecks are so long, again, you have to plan 8 years out, companies that sell them, like GE Vernova, are starting to instill turbine reservation fees. So companies essentially have to pay a certain amount of money to secure their reservation for the gas turbine. And what's been reported is that those reservation fees are in the realm of about $25 million. So that is to say that if that $22 million bidding security is an issue, then this $25 million turbine reservation fee is certainly going to be an issue. Um, One other important note here is that for both countries, Philippines and Vietnam, the turbine shortage is just one among many other issues that have plagued the development of these gas-fired power plants. In Vietnam, for example, almost none of the new projects have secured key contracts with customers that are typically necessary to secure financing, right? Because bankers need to know that if you get a loan to build your project, you're going to be able to pay that loan back over the long term. And those contracts with customers, so-called power purchase agreements or PPAs, are essentially proof that your project is going to earn enough revenue to pay back those long-term loans. So if you don't have that proof, if you don't have that PPA, um, then you're not able to prove that you can service your debt, and it becomes nearly impossible to secure financing for your project. So, again, just to sum this up, the gas turbine issue is certainly adding costs and making barriers even higher, but it's just one among many other issues that are problematic for these gas plants.
Sam, you mentioned like they have not difficulties, but like challenges in order to draw more attention for the investments, and then these structures that they have, and then the proof of loan payment and stuff. So, are these like focal point of like improvement they should be so that they can attract more investments coming in for these projects?
There's certainly a lot of ironing out of the discussions that needs to happen and is happening, right? So a lot of the reason that those PPAs haven't been signed and have been negotiated for many, many years at a time is because the government, which is essentially a counterparty, the state-owned distribution utility is a counterparty in those contracts. It doesn't want to have to pay the high costs either. It's very worried about the high volatility of LNG fuel prices, but it's also worried about these some of these turbine issues and the ability of project developers to pass on those high costs to the state-owned distribution utility and then to consumers, right? So there's a give and take happening here. There's negotiations that are in the works, but it really remains to be seen whether or not the government is going to allow those higher costs um, from happening. In other words, whether the government is going to sign those PPAs or whether or not these projects will remain stalled. And my hunch is that many of them will remain stalled at least over the next 5 or so years. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam, for the information and concrete information. So I think these both region, the countries, Philippines and Vietnam, they have slightly similar but different situations and challenges. So, I mean, there are also other countries in the regions that those experience can be shared and can be flagged to not happen, but to take some positive impact and changes. What would be those like key lessons can Southeast Asia learn from both Philippines and Vietnam?
I think the biggest lesson to understand here is that price volatility and energy insecurity are part and parcel of the LNG industry. And so when you base your energy development plans around this technology, you're essentially hitching your wagon to the roller coaster of global gas markets. And you essentially have no idea what the outcome is going to be in terms of cost and in terms of energy security. That applies not only to the fuel itself, which is uh, significantly more expensive than other sources of energy, but it also applies again to the hardware. The cost increases that we're seeing for gas turbines are again part of these global supply and demand fundamentals that countries are like Vietnam and the Philippines are exposing themselves to. So I think that's the biggest takeaway here is that there's no getting around the price volatility, the high costs, and the insecurity of this fuel.
Thank you, Sam. That gives us a really clear look at how this global shortage is playing out for these countries and project delays and all those shifts and changes. Let's move on to the next challenges, which we you have just discussed about this investments, the financings, the governance on these in Southeast Asia, brought up path to energy resilience. So the question will be here: the turbine delays, reshaping financings, the investor confidence, and then a national energy policy. So on that policy side and financial, when LNG projects face about a couple of years to 3 years in terms of the delays in a turbine, so what basically would have happened or happened in terms of investor confidence and the government's responses to these happenings and challenges?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick note that I think it takes way longer to build an LNG fired power plant than 2 to 3 years. Actually, markets like the Vietnam and the Philippines have been trying for decades and only recently brought online, you know, new individual LNG fired power plants. So these timelines, factoring in the gas turbine shortages, can extend well beyond 2 to 3 years. We're talking, you know 7 to 8 years, sometimes more than a decade, right?
Yeah.
With the added costs, delays, and logistical challenges, investor confidence certainly begins to wane. But this can take very different forms depending on the structure of the market itself. So in the Philippines, there is a legal requirement that private distribution utilities, because the system is privatized there, that these distribution utilities procure power from the cheapest cost sources. And to win projects and offtake contracts, the developers of gas and LNG fired power plants have to submit the lowest cost bids and they have to compete with other technologies. Well, if they're unable to do so because of these higher prices related to fuel and gas turbines, that's when we see this quagmire of delays really start to add up, and investor enthusiasm really start to deteriorate. Um, the recently canceled project that I mentioned before in the Philippines has been in the works for at least 7 years, but it has repeatedly failed to secure customers by winning um, those bid processes. Um, in Vietnam, it's slightly different because power plans are really developed by the government, and private firms are allowed to build and operate projects over their lifetime. But if costs rise and contracts take decades to negotiate, investor enthusiasm wanes. So one example here is the Nissan LNG project in Vietnam. This is a very large project. It had initial interest from a number of large international firms, Japanese, South Korean, and Thai firms. But after two bidding rounds, no companies have bid to build the project, and international bidding was ultimately canceled. And there's a very strong quote from one LNG project developer who recently expressed concern about the inability to win bids and to secure those PPA contracts that I mentioned. This developer said, quote, "Without guaranteed cash flow, it's nearly impossible to raise capital, especially with LNG price volatility." He said, "Investing in these projects feels like entering a trap." Right. So with this, governments are really starting to look at other options. Again, maybe the maintenance of existing coal plants or efforts to spur nuclear projects. But again, I think the main emphasis has really been on reducing the long-term need for gas by maximizing the use of renewable energy sources like wind and solar. And I talked about some of the Philippines' approach with its recent successful renewable energy auctions. But in Vietnam, you know, solar capacity went from near zero in 2018 to over 21 gigawatts by 2023, while gas-fired power generation has fallen 55% since 2015. Right? So there will always be issues with these kinds of dramatic changes. But over the long term, the government revised its power development plans to increase 2050 solar targets by 6 times, right? So, I mean, all told, I think the idea of gas as a quote bridge fuel is being completely debunked by the challenges for gas and the opportunities for renewable energy growth.
Thank you, Sam, for the lessons that we can learn. So we want to go beyond those immediate delays lesson, but another deeper lesson challenges that how the Southeast Asia plans will pan out with their plans and strategic plans and finances for its energy future.
I think again, I mean, I think we're going to start to see a lot more room for renewable energy growth. Certainly, both economies have rapidly increasing economic growth and electricity demand growth. So it's going to have to come from some combination of resources. But increasingly, LNG is being viewed as um, simply untenable. And I think we're starting to see renewables really take on a more dramatic share of the future energy mix in um, both countries. You know, both countries may be able to build individual new LNG fired power plants one at a time on a case by case basis. Say, if one plant is actually able to get the gas turbines and secure contracts and land and permits, etc., you may get these new solo plants kind of spring up, but that's a very far cry from the wholesale build out that they are currently envisioning for gas-fired power plants. And for every year of delays for new gas plants, that essentially means that another resource will step in to fill the gap. And so ultimately, these countries are going to need less gas and imported LNG over the long term. So it's a feedback loop that does not look promising for the build out of gas and LNG facilities in the region, or their or for their role in the long term energy transition.
Thank you, Sam. We're about to wrap up. So the topics that we bringing from the very beginning, whether the government's counting on the gas can really serve as a reliable bridge fuel. So we've been talking about, you've been mentioning, discuss about this bridge fuel. So all these setbacks, challenges, what does all this mean for gas as a bridge fuel? What keeps organizations and for you also being optimistic, or any other impacts in your opinion about the SEA Southeast Asia's clean energy future?
Yeah, I think it's another great question. What does this mean for gas and LNG writ large? You know, the world is currently in the midst of the largest build out of new supply facilities for that liquefied natural gas. These are the facilities where that natural gas is frozen and loaded onto ships in places like Qatar and the United States and Australia, right? And this build out of these new supply facilities is happening under the assumption that markets, primarily in Asia, are going to grow quickly and they're going to purchase a lot of this newly available LNG supply. Under industry forecasts, South and Southeast Asia are expected to be the largest growth markets for LNG over the next several decades. But what we're seeing and what we've talked about are clear challenges in building the infrastructure in Asia needed to absorb all of that new supply. right? So the limitations on the supply of gas turbines present a hard limit on how many new LNG fired power plants are going to be built across the region. And if that demand for the fuel does not materialize, meaning if these large potential growth markets in Asia can't buy a lot of that new supply, then the LNG industry really stands to lose money. And the financial case for investing in fossil fuels really begins to wane. So, in other words, these gas turbine shortages, I think, present a real risk to the whole central thesis of LNG investment and really the safer bet and the future of low cost, energy secure resources lies in renewable energy development.
Can we say that even though there are some delays and setbacks, making this renewable energy more practical, can we say that for Southeast Asia region, the future is already here? Can we say we're more clean, more flexible, and the local governments they already have energy solutions, or is it just short term and long term? There are still some challenges.
I think there's a lot of challenges that need to be figured out before we can make the claim that the clean energy future is already here. Certainly, both the Philippines and Vietnam have very large amounts of fossil fuels in their energy mix. But I think what we're seeing um, with the development of new power capacity that the future lies in renewables. And I think the Philippines auction, awarding over 10 gigawatts of projects to wind and solar and others, is a key sign of that, right? Those are projects that are expected to come online this decade before 2029. And so, again, with all of the delays to new gas fired power plants, I think the region is on the cusp of a really rapid um, emergence and expansion in the market and the industry. But certainly, I know that the cancellation of recent projects in the Philippines have been due largely, if not entirely, to you know groups on the ground that are working to expose some of these challenges and make them clearer to the government. And I think more broadly, the public narrative around gas is shifting. And, I mentioned going back 5 years where in the Philippines, every politician was supporting LNG and gas as clean, sustainable, and affordable. Um, but I think we're really starting to see, um, market disruption after market disruption take a bite out of that pro gas, pro fossil fuel narrative, and that energy is really being shifted towards a greater focus on renewables.
Thank you so much, Sam, for all this knowledge for our listeners and the information and updates, especially for Southeast Asia, focusing Philippines and Vietnam. We hope to see you again in the next episodes. If we can have a development stories about turbines or LNG in our next few episodes. If you would love to join, we will be very happy to have you in the future as well.
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you, thank you. The turbine shortage, I just want to wrap up for our listener. It might be just a technical story, but as we have heard today from Sam, it reveals something much bigger, how Southeast Asia choices today, it would help shape the energy future for decades to come. Thank you for tuning in today's episode. If you find this episode insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest in the energy transition. For more in-depth analysis and updates, visit our website at energytracker.asia. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.